let's talk about consequences. Let's talk about natural versus logical consequences and what most parents get wrong. I'm Nicholeen Peck, and I teach all over the world about parenting, good communication, how to build strong family bonds, and education, all through the lens of the principle self-government. And in this video, we're talking about consequences. In this video, we're going to talk about common misunderstandings about consequences, and then we're going to talk about natural consequences. We're going to talk about logical consequences, and we're going to talk about how to use consequences more effectively in your parenting interactions. So let's talk about common misunderstandings with consequences. Now, when I mention consequences, it's really important for me to let you know that there are positive consequences as well as negative consequences. When parents start talking about consequences, the conversation almost always turns exclusively to negative consequences. In fact, I think most parents think that in order to solve a problem, you must focus on negative consequence. That is a common misunderstanding. Did you know that focusing on a positive consequence can actually be more effective at motivating a positive behavior than a negative consequence can be? It's true. So don't forget the power of using positive consequences. Positive consequences include all kinds of things in your daily life. You don't need to bring out money and special rewards and trips and all kinds of expensive things. Sometimes a good positive consequence is just like a word of praise, a high five, or explaining that you recognize somebody behaved in a very mature way. But of course, we can use some of those other synthetic positive consequences as well. So let's talk about misunderstandings with negative consequences. Did you know that negative consequences don't need to hurt a person to be effective? It's 100% true. It is a common misunderstanding that many parents have that your child has to be hurt somehow by a negative consequence. I think somehow this stems back to the we'll say Old Testament Bible, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality. Listen, I feel inconvenienced, so you're going to be inconvenienced. I feel hurt, so you're going to be hurt. And so then we get into this emotional feelings manipulation stuff where because a parent is bugged, they're going to make sure that their child feels pain. And the parent thinks that a child does not learn unless they get some reaction that's an emotional reaction back from the child. So we hear parents say things to their children like they'll give them a negative consequence, the child's crying or whining about it, and they'll see, how do you like that? Well, don't do it again in the future, and then you don't have to experience this. And so it's this kind of like rub it in your face mentality with negative consequences. This is absolutely not effective at teaching a child how to behave the correct way. In fact, if anything, this is a type of bullying, picking on, and it's very much emotional manipulation. I know parents don't like to hear that they engage in emotional manipulation, but it does happen sometimes. So we've got to keep that in mind. So let's talk about natural consequences. That's all the buzz, right? Everybody wants to focus on natural consequences. They don't want to use things like spankings and timeouts and those kinds of things. Okay, I like natural consequences. In fact, when a person is an adult, they actually learn the majority of their things by natural consequence. For instance, if I stay up too late, then in the morning when my alarm goes off, I'm too tired. In fact, I often ruin my day. I might even make a bad decision like hitting that snooze button one time too many, and then I'll be late to work. So there's more natural consequences that come into my day. But did you know that even adults have artificial consequences that teach them as well? Things like a speeding ticket. That's not a natural consequence. That's an artificial consequence that we have put into place to try to keep people safe or protected from themselves, or maybe from other people as well. But we have a lot of artificial consequences that are in our culture. They're maybe not natural consequences. Why do we use these artificial consequences? Well, because sometimes the artificial consequences are actually more merciful than the natural consequence. And sometimes people learn better from an artificial consequence. Sometimes an artificial consequence actually instills more logic in the person. You can always talk about a natural consequence, but we shouldn't find ourselves waiting for a natural consequence. A lot of people wait for natural consequences because they want their child to feel pain. They want them to suffer. But did you know that you can utilize an artificial consequence? You can bring in some logic, do some teaching to the child's prefrontal cortex, and then they don't ever have to experience the pain of the natural consequence. It's actually possible. And it works really great for things like daily chores like dishes and stuff like that. If your child doesn't do the dishes, the food's going to get crusted on the dishes and it's going to be harder to scrub them off. Also, you could start to have an odor that happens in your kitchen because bacteria grows in the sink where the dishes have been put. Is the child going to recognize all of that and put it together? Probably not. So we shouldn't wait for 2 weeks without doing our dishes for our child to suffer through not having a clean dish to use. So what we should do is when we do a correction, we say something like, you didn't do your dishes immediately, which means that part of the natural consequence is that the food could get stuck on there, but the artificial consequence is now you're going to earn an extra chore. So maybe the food isn't all the way stuck on yet, so they're not facing that full natural consequence. Maybe the kitchen doesn't smell yet. So they're going to do an artificial consequence, an extra chore, which helps them with their character development because work is the antidote for a sick character, and then they're going to acknowledge the logic behind the consequence, that they got to accept their consequence. So this whole channel is about teaching self-government. If you subscribe to the channel, then you know that I'm a big fan of using extra chores, and there's a reason for that. Extra chores actually teach the person that they have to accept their own consequence. Natural consequences don't always teach that, but things like extra chores are a logical way for a child to recognize, I made a mistake, I did something that I shouldn't have done, and now I'm going to purposely own that. I'm going to accept that, and that's going to help me learn self-government. They learn to logically put those dots together so that when you're using the skills and principles of self-government that I talk about on this channel, that the child has more of an opportunity to be able to accept those consequences when they need correction. Consequences work best when they are part of a system. If they are not part of a system, then they might be emotionally manipulative. We need to be careful about that. So to teach you about a system for consequences that really works, I highly recommend my next video, which is called The Calm Parenting System That Makes Boundaries Stick. Click on the link to that video next. I'll see you there.